Okay, now we're going to talk about some of the widgets that we can use when we're building a desktop application. And we'll start with something called a JFrame. A JFrame is used to create basically all GUI-based desktop applications. A JFrame is really just a window with a title bar and a border. So we've all used windows before. They all kind of look the same. They have a border, they have some way to kill the program, and they have this main content area. So this whole thing, this is called a JFrame. And we can look at some code here. Okay, so how do you create a JFrame? How do you create one of these things? Well, what we can do is create a class that extends the class JFrame. So JFrame starts with a J. That's a good indication that it comes from the swing library. Now, if we want to do things with handling events, we also would want to import some of these AWT events. We don't handle any events in here, but in pretty much any desktop application, we're going to want to handle events, and you'll want to import these at the top of your program. Okay, now this class extends JFrame. It has a constructor, and the first thing we do inside the constructor is we use super to call the base class constructor. So here this is really calling the JFrame constructor. This takes a string that sets the title. Okay, so every window has this thing called a title, and if we want to set the title, we would specify something in that call to the base class constructor. We also have this thing called a content pane. Okay, this is just what it sounds like. This is where all the content goes. We're going to add other widgets to the main part of the window. Okay. The next thing we do in the constructor is we call a couple methods that are inherited from the JFrame class. So the first one is setSize. This says we want the height and width to be 600 by 400 pixels. Okay, the next thing we do is we set the location. We say from the top left corner of your monitor, go 100 pixels in the X direction, okay, to the right, and 300 pixels in the Y direction or down. And that's where the initial location of that window is going to be. A JFrame by default is not visible. This is one of the few widgets that we explicitly have to say make this thing visible. If we don't do this, the window won't show up. And lastly, the default close operation. This says, well, what should happen when you click the X? Normally when we click this X, the program closes, okay, or ends, but we could also make it do other things, like we could just hide it and make the program never really close. We can do actually all kinds of things with the window. But most of the time, the default close operation will just be an exit on close. So this is a constant defined in a static constant defined in the JFrame class. Oops. Okay, so I've precompiled this code here, and we'll see that we really do have this window that's about the size I mentioned, and it started at about the location I mentioned. Now the driver is actually very simple. So we have this main function, and here what we're doing is we're creating this JFrame test object. Okay. Now this setVisible, let's go back to this for a second. Not only does this make the JFrame visible, but it also creates a separate thread of execution from the main thread. And basically this thread just sits and waits for people to interact with the window. Okay. Now the driver has a flow of control, right? It's always from the start of main to the end of main. That we call, that's a thread of execution. Now when we create this JFrame, we're creating a new thread of execution, And as long as there's at least one thread actively running in the JVM, the program will continue to run. So even though the main thread ends pretty quickly, okay, all it does is create the JFrame and get it going, the program will continue to run until we close the JFrame. Okay, so we said the JFrames always have these content panes. Let's start adding some things to the content pane. We'll start with this thing called a label. Okay, so there is a type called a JLabel, and the purpose of a JLabel is to hold text that's going to be displayed. And it's most often used to label other inputs like text boxes and buttons and things like that. Okay, so it's just a simple holder of text. Okay, so a very common thing that we do is we create this class that extends JFrame, and we have a bunch of private data members that are widgets. Now, the way we work with these widgets is somewhere in the constructor you'll want to create the label objects, and the JLabel class has a constructor that takes some text. This is what's going to show up on the label. A few other things we could do, we could set the tooltip text, so when you mouse over a widget and you wait a second, there's this opportunity to display a little bit of information about what that widget is. In this case it just says this is a label. And then we need to add the widget to the content pane. So we can get the content pane by calling the getContentPane method, and again that comes from the JFrame class. We inherit that, we absorb that. And since it's a container, we are going to add something to it, and what we're going to add is the label. Okay, so again I've compiled this, and if I run it, we'll see, yep, here's the application. Now we have this text, hello world, and if I mouse over it, we say this is a label. Okay, of course we can make the window bigger or smaller. It's a normal window like any other. And the program will stay alive until I click this X. And now you should see that we get the command prompt back, and that should prove that the program really does run. As long as there's an active thread, the JVM is up and running. Okay, next let's talk about a button. So label isn't very exciting. Button is a little bit more exciting. Okay, so again we have JFrame JFrame test that extends JFrame, and now we have this JFrame class implementing the action listener interface that we talked about in the last video. Okay, we'll come back to that in a second. That basically is just a contract that says this class is going to provide some implementation for the one method inside that interface. So we still have our label, but now we have a button called B1. Okay, and we have an additional piece of data, an integer that's going to keep track of the number of times the button has been clicked. So again, this is pretty common, as we have, these widgets are private data members, but we also have data members that are used for other things. Okay, so we have a constructor. Here we're setting the layout of the JFrame. So the layout has to do with how things are laid out on the screen. And a flow layout just says when we add these widgets, they're going to be added from left to right. We'll talk more about layouts in the next video. Then we have our label. Here's where we create the button. Okay, so the button constructor takes a string. This is going to be the text that shows up on the button. And we're using our reference B1, which is of type JButton. And we're saying we want it to point to this new button object. Okay, next what we have to do is we have to register an event listener. Okay, and this method takes a reference to an object that implements the action listener interface. And what we're doing is we're passing a reference to this. So we're saying when this button is clicked, right, the action listener for this button, the one who's going to be notified when it's clicked, is this object. So remember, this always refers to the object that has the flow of control. So in an object-oriented system, we have all these little objects, and the flow of control moves through the objects. This always refers to the object that has the current flow. Okay, then we get the content pane and add the button. Right. Okay, so when we add an action listener and we say that this is going to be the class that is going to be notified when the button is clicked, well, this class must then implement the action listener interface, which you remember has just a single method called action performed. So when that button is clicked, the GUI thread is going to arrange for this method to be called. It's going to ask the button basically, what's your listener? It's going to find a reference to this JFrame, and it's going to call the action performed method. And it's going to send along with the call a little bit of information about the event itself, okay, which we're storing here in E. So when somebody clicks the button, what we'll do is increase the number of clicks by 1 and then change the text that's on the button. So the button, once we start clicking it, will always show how many times it's been clicked. Okay, so here we have our label that's on our JFrame, and once I start clicking the button, every single time I click that, that method is being called. The number of clicks is being increased, and we're changing the text on the button. Okay, and again, this is all taking place because we have this GUI thread that's just sitting and waiting for the user to interact with the JFrame. And again, that thread will exist as long as the program is running. So if I click the X here, that'll be when the program actually stops running. Okay, next we have this thing called a JTextfield. And TextField is used to hold text. It's used for gathering input, text input from the user. So again, I just have this widget. Its type is JTextfield, and I'm calling it TextField. Now all this code is the same as the previous examples, except this part here. When you create a JTextfield, one of the things you can pass in the constructor is how many characters wide you want this text field to be. Text field also generates events, so we're gonna register an action listener. So when somebody types in some text in the text field and hits the enter key, that generates an event, and we want this JFrame to handle that event. Now this JFrame is also handling the button press. We'll see how we square that in a second inside the action perform method. But we have to tell the text field who to notify when these events occur, and then lastly we add the text field to the content pane. Okay, the action performed here, we're going to pass in a reference to the action event, and then what we're going to do is we're going to check, well, what is the source of the event? So remember I said every event gets created by some widget, and the way to get a reference to the widget is to say e.getSource. So this basically checks to see, was it the button that generated the event, or was it, in this case, was it the text field? If it wasn't the button, it must have been the text field. Okay, if it was the button, we'll do what we did before, increase the number of clicks and set the text on the button. But if it wasn't the button, well, the only other widget that added an action listener was the text field. So we can assume this was the text field. And we're going to set the label equal to whatever's inside the text box. So e.getActionCommand, if the event comes from a JTextfield, e.getActionCommand is going to return the text, the string that was inside that text field. And we're going to set the label equal to that. Another thing you can do is you can choose to make the text field uneditable. So it'll still be visible, but you won't be able to type in it anymore. Okay, so if I run this one, we still have our label, we still have our button that we can click, but now when I start to type stuff in, I hit the Enter button, we'll notice that the text changed a little bit. I added a few more exclamation points there. And the button still works, so that GUI thread is still running. However, this text field is no longer editable, so I can't add anything more to it. Okay, so again, this is a pretty common thing that we do. We create a class that extends JFrame and implements Action Listener. We have a bunch of widgets, and we have some additional data. And the first thing we do is we set up the GUI, create all the widgets, add them to the content pane, and then we basically just sit and wait for events to occur. And when they occur, we handle them inside this listener.